I like science as a theme. I got interested in Darwin in particular in 1996 when I was then head of the London bureau for the New York Times. And I was asked to come to Darwin's estate. It's called Down House in the county of Kent, about 17 miles southwest of London. And I went there and the place was falling apart. The roof was leaking, the greenhouse was collapsed. It was a real mess. There was kind of fungus on the ceilings. And they wanted me to write a story for the New York Times to bring in some funds. So they gave me a kind of a really VIP tour, which was amazing. And they let me go into Darwin's study, and they removed the velvet rope, and they actually let me sit in the chair that he sat in. He wrote all of his books in a chair. And it was this odd chair filled with horsehair. He had put little kind of wheels on the bottom so he could wheel around, look at his microscope, and then as I was sitting there, the curator lifted a board up and put the board across the arms, and it just fit right there. It's kind of like being locked in a ride on a roller coaster or something. And the board had a little cloth on it, and she said, that's where he wrote Origin of the Species. And I looked down, and I saw these little ink marks and things, and I suddenly felt I'm sitting in the cradle of a revolution. This is where he went through his thinking that changed all of modern biology. And then after that, she said, now come here. She picked the board up, and about 8 feet away in the corner, there was a curtain. And she moved the curtain aside, and I looked, and it turned out he had constructed a little kind of makeshift lavatory. There was a basin in a kind of little platform. And she said, did you know he had an incredible ailment? And to this day, we don't know what it is. But he would be writing, and suddenly his stomach would seize up, and he would run over there and retch, sometimes 2 or 3 times in the morning. And I thought, well, isn't that interesting? A man who sailed around the world for 5 years, had all these incredible adventures, then he came and retreated to this kind of country estate, never traveled again, and had all of these incredible illnesses. Was it psychological? That seems to be the only explanation, because none of his symptoms fit any known disease. There have been a lot of theories about this. Some people say he picked up a parasite in South America. Others say it might have been some kind of fever that came and went. But the symptoms don't match. So a lot of people now think it was basically a psychosomatic illness. He knew what he was doing. He knew that his theory would overturn a lot of accepted religious orthodoxy, and yet he felt compelled to go ahead and do it. So I thought that's an interesting subject. At certain moments in history, it's as if a theory is in the air or something is in the air, and other people kind of at the same time come close to it. Well, in Darwin's case, evolution, the concept of evolution, had been around for years. His own grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, believed in evolution, as did other people, because when they looked at animals, it struck some people as a kind of natural thought that we resemble them in so many ways. It's kind of interesting that the London Zoo just opened up around this time, and people suddenly became accustomed to seeing exotic animals. The gorilla had just been found in Africa. People hadn't even known of the existence of gorillas before. Suddenly there was this information out there about kind of lower mammals, lower species. But Darwin had one key difference, and that is Darwin was able to figure out the mechanism by which evolution takes place. In other words, he came up with the theory, which he called the theory of natural selection. And all it says is offspring occasionally have variations, positive or negative, that enable them to either survive or die out better than the general run of the population. A very commonsensical idea once you have it. But if it wasn't there to begin with, the idea of it popping into your head is kind of amazing. He had a great supporter named Thomas Huxley. And Thomas Huxley said something to the effect of, when he heard of it, how stupid not to have thought of it myself. because it was such a brilliant insight. Interestingly enough, Darwin had this insight during his trip to the Galapagos, which was on the Beagle, the ship called the Beagle, that went around the world for 5 years, I think 1831 to 1836. He didn't have it suddenly. It came to him after he returned to England, but we know he more or less had it within a few years of his return to England. He didn't do anything about it for 22 years. He didn't write it. He had the greatest idea, one of the greatest in the history of science, and yet he couldn't commit it to paper. And it was not until one day that he was sitting in his study in the townhouse and got a letter from somebody he barely knew named Alfred Russel Wallace, who proposed the exact same theory. And he got this letter and he thought to himself, my God, this is, for 20 years I've known about this idea, and I haven't done anything about it. And Wallace asked his help in getting the idea distributed. And Darwin must have had a quandary. I mean, this letter came from the Moluccans on the other side of the world. He could have thrown it away, pretended he never got it, but he was too honorable a man. So he called up all of his friends who had known about his idea, because he would talk about it, and basically said, what do I do? And they said, well, tell you what, why don't we present 2 papers, one by you and one by him, which they did at something called the Linnaean Society. So Darwin's paper, which was a bit better, and then he followed it with a book, basically got the credit for it. And Russell Wallace's theory came to him in a bout of malaria when he was lying in a hut with grass roof, and he had this tremendous fever, and it just jumped into his mind like that. So you can see it was an idea whose time had come in a way, but Darwin's great contribution was that he explained the mechanism of evolution, how it could happen over millions and millions of years, and that suddenly made the idea, gave it credibility. The theories initially were very close. In fact, when Darwin got a little kind of extract of Wallace's paper in that same letter, he said to himself, even some of the subtitles were ones he had been planning to use himself for his chapter headings. Wallace then came to visit him, and their ideas melded pretty well. And Wallace was the one who said you should call it, you should use the phrase survival of the fittest. That was Wallace's contribution. It was a phrase that had been used by a philosopher, Spencer, with regard to something else. And Wallace said that will make it clear that it's not nature doing the selection. That is to say, a kind of godlike thing that is selecting species that survive and species that die out, but the process itself, the species that are either ill-equipped or well-equipped to live or to perish. In later years, Wallace kind of went off the tracks a little bit. He turned slightly mystical. He began to believe in spiritual things that Darwin never put any stock in. So they did part ways intellectually. And I have to say, I also think, Darwin was a member of a certain class. He had money. His family was rich. Wedgwood, China, basically, on both sides of his family, the fortune came from making china. And Wallace was poor and lower class. And I've often thought that made a difference, because Darwin had a kind of natural entree into this world of science, and Wallace was a kind of outsider in terms of British society. We use the word theory of evolution. In the world of science, theory doesn't mean quite what it does to us laymen, where we say, well, I have a theory, that it's going to rain tomorrow because it's been raining for 4 days. Theory in science means usually something that's widely accepted. I mean, the theory of gravity, gravity is accepted. Newton is accepted. So I think without question, evolution has now been shown to exist because there are actual studies that prove it. One is in the Galapagos itself and involves finches, which were of interest to Darwin. There's been a team from Princeton, a married couple, that had this long study extending over 20 years there, in which they examined how various characteristics of finches would change depending on whether or not it was a rainy season or a wet season, and whether or not they could get nourishment out of different kinds of seeds that would actually change the shape of the beak. This is captured in a book called something like The Beak of the Finch by a well-known science writer. Something like AIDS, the AIDS virus. The reason it's so difficult, one reason to counter it, is that it's constantly undergoing an evolution. It's changing. New medicines come in to fight it, and by and large can destroy 90% of the infections, and the remaining 10% evolve to the point where they can actually survive and beat the medication back. So there is, in a real sense, there's evolution going on all the time. It's never stopping. We still live in this world that's constantly evolving. Now, of course, it's still controversial. It was controversial in Darwin's day for the very same reasons. The arguments haven't changed against it. Primarily, there is, I guess, an argument which was then called the watchmaker theory. According to the watchmaker theory, it's kind of really a metaphor. Imagine yourself walking through a field and you find a pocket watch and you pick it up. It's so beautiful, so intricate, it's working, you see it, and you must assume there has been a watchmaker, because how could it exist without that? So that same theory has been applied by today's people who oppose evolution to say, well, how could we really just be the product of evolution? We're so complicated. We have intellect, we have emotion. How could we really exist without somebody to make us? They have given ground, most of them, and say, well, they could see evolution in minor ways, but they can't believe either that the origin didn't start with a creator, or that there wasn't somebody somehow guiding the process, a God basically guiding the process. I think the beauty of the theory is you don't need to rely on God to believe in the theory, because it's kind of self-contained. It can explain everything, except, of course, the genesis of life itself. And, I think scientists are getting pretty close to that now. They're close to creating life in the laboratory on a very, very primitive scale. Who knows what will actually come of it. There are many people who have found common ground. Even people like Einstein, although this question is always debated, exactly how much of a believer was he. But certainly at certain periods of his life, he believed in God, and yet he also upheld evolution. There doesn't automatically have to be a contradiction there. On the other hand, I think you'd have to recognize that if you embrace evolution in all of its aspects, it does mitigate against the need for a God somewhere along the line to explain life as we know it on Earth. Doesn't mean, it doesn't force you not to believe in it, but you can certainly then suddenly find that a simple belief in the kind of mechanics of evolution itself can do away with the concept if you choose to be agnostic or an atheist. What it means basically is it doesn't force you to exclude the existence of God, but it does mean that you can rely simply upon the explanations provided by science. If you choose to be an atheist or an agnostic, you don't. It kind of limits now the space for intervention by a divine being. It is true that Emma, his wife, was deeply religious, and even as a young man, Darwin had planned to have a career in the church. He wanted to be a country vicar. Doesn't mean he was deeply religious, but he accepted the existence of God as a young man. before he went on his travels around the world. So at a period there, he definitely was religious. His views changed over time, and especially as and after he came up with his theory of evolution. This did cause tremendous grief on the part of his wife. And in fact, his wife wrote him a letter, which you can see at his house in Down in England, in which basically she said, she lived in the same house, but she wrote him a letter. It was that kind of society. She basically expressed sadness because she thought, and she said, when I'm dead, I'll be up there for all eternity. And you, because of what your beliefs are, will be someplace else. So we'll be separated. And Darwin wrote in the margins of this letter, he wrote a little note that said, "No, many times have I read this and wept." So he was also torn apart by the fact that he was causing his wife grief and that he was going up against the established church. And the church really did attack him. There was a famous debate, Soapy Sam Wilberforce, who was the Bishop of Oxford, in which Darwin's theories were lampooned, and they made Punch magazine wrote these caricatures of him as an ape and all of this kind of thing. The kind of fuss he hated. He was very shy when it came to that. As to his views, it is not true that he had a deathbed conversion. That's been put to rest. There was a European woman, Countess, I've forgotten her name, but it's known, who kind of made that up. And she made it up as a way to try and defeat his theory. We do know in his later years, Darwin became kind of increasingly not just agnostic, but probably even atheistic at a certain point. And you can imagine he was being asked all the time, letters from around the world, does this mean you don't believe in God? And he would answer them, he would kind of dance around it. But I think the suggestion is, by the end, he talked of the religious instinct. He said something like the desire for an instinct is just, the desire for a religion is just an instinct, sort of like a monkey's instinct. Well, I don't think you'd say that if you were a deep, deep believer. There was a cousin of his, Sir Francis Galton, who was directly responsible for eugenics. I don't think Darwin, in his actual books, said that one race had evolved farther than other races. It is known, though, that during his trip on the Beagle, when he got to Tierra del Fuego at the very tip of South America, he was very shocked by what he called the savages, shocked by their dress and by he thought they were totally primitive. In an odd way, it may have made it a little easier for him to even come up with the theory of evolution if they could be viewed by him as a middle step. But I don't think that would be more psychological. I don't think he ever really committed that notion to paper. He was, though, a product of his time, the Victoria, England, and according to the values and standards of Victorian England, the best thing to be in the world was a white European. Better than that was to be a white English person. Better than that was to be a white English man. So I think he thought in his own mind he was at the very top of the pyramid, the way it was viewed back then. But I don't think he categorized races as such. And at the same time that he had this sense of a hierarchy, social hierarchy or whatever, he was a kind of odd egalitarian when it came to species, so that he almost seemed to genuinely believe, that a dog or a worm was as good as we are because we've all survived, according to his belief. We've all made it from the very beginning this far. So he had this odd horizontal kind of democratic view. At the same time, I think he had this typical Victorian vertical view of organization of people. Let me talk about the arguments against evolution. In Darwin's time, the first was origin of life. He didn't know. He didn't pretend to know. He put that question aside. The second was, how do you explain how characteristics are passed down? If that's such an important part of your theory, that there's a slight mutation that then exists, how does that happen? He didn't know the answer to that. He came up with these kind of oddball theories later on, but we now do know that. That's DNA. That's totally proven. Third was this watchmaker theory I mentioned, which is basically just a metaphor. But the fourth was a more complicated one, which is, take any specific organ, like the human eye. Now you can imagine certain evolutionary changes bit by bit, but how could you imagine an eye suddenly coming into being? Here you would have, presumably, a kind of proto-human, a primitive human without sight, and then suddenly it has a child that has an eye. It's too complicated an organ to exist. Well, that argument now has actually been disproven because it's been shown you can, in fact, imagine evolutionary stages leading up to an eye, beginning with a very primitive photocell that's responsive to light. And in fact, there are different animals that illustrate this already. So all of the criticisms that have been leveled against Darwin back then, 4 or 5 of them, have all been knocked down today. So that means now suddenly you've leveled the field and you look at the other side of the ledger and say, what is proof that it's existing? Well, there is a fossil record. The fossils were often cited by critics of Darwin, but since then we've discovered more and more and more fossils that do fill in the record. There are great gaps in it, obviously, huge gaps, especially when it comes to humans, the hominid species. But as time goes on, more and more of those gaps are being filled. The dating period for fossils is actually now much better than it ever was. Carbon-14 and other methods which didn't exist in Darwin's day. So we now pretty much establish that the Earth is, in fact, extremely old, which is a critical point for Darwin because he has to say these are small changes that happened over an extensive time period. They didn't happen, in 4,000 years, or creationists, strict creationists, believe the Earth is only 6,000 years old. How would they explain a fossil that's proven to be, over 1 million years old? That's the dilemma for them to explain. And then there are these examples that I mentioned before of evolution that's continuing, that you can see in the part of fruit flies. That's why there's so many experiments with fruit flies, or bacteria that evolve quickly and change, or these long-term studies of things like finches in the Galapagos. It happened during this wonderful trip on the Beagle. It happened, it began to happen in the Galapagos Islands. These are the islands, wonderful islands off the part of Ecuador, about 100 miles offshore. We went to visit them 5 years ago now. When you get there, it's kind of almost like an Eden, in that there's been so little commerce that the animals that are there aren't frightened of you. So you get this sense that you're walking in a kind of almost a paradise before the introduction of, man has turned everything upside down. He had, for example, attended a meal with the governor general of one of the islands, who made the point that he could tell, he said over this lunch, he said, I can tell which island a giant tortoise comes from just by looking at it. Because the tortoises were on all the islands, but they didn't communicate with these are land tortoises with each other, and they evolved slightly differently. Darwin didn't, he wrote that, but it didn't kind of click with him, but it must have stayed in his mind. Then the great breakthrough came when he shot a lot of birds. He was collecting specimens during this whole trip, sending them back to London. So he went to the different islands and shot a lot of finches. When he returned, he gave the finches over to be kind of categorized to the museum. And a museum leader, the director, said to him something interesting. He said, you know, they look alike in some ways, but they're actually different species. All these are different species. And suddenly it occurred to him that he hadn't named which islands they came from, threw them all in a bag. So he had to contact the captain of the ship, a fellow named Robert Fitzroy, and asked to see his specimens. Fitzroy also collected them. Luckily, Fitzroy had tagged them, so he could say this one was from this island, that was from the other island, and he could see that they were in fact very different depending on the island that they were raised and spent their whole life on. That is what really fundamentally made him come to a basic understanding that the separation, geographic separation, has made them grow into a different species. But that's only kind of one bit of evidence. Then he began thinking and thinking, and he had a little path behind his house, a little half-mile long path, and he would walk it every day in the afternoon and think, until finally he did things like began breeding experiments with pigeons, talking to breeders. He came to understand that breeders are able to kind of get a superior type of bird or cow or whatever it is by taking the offspring and very carefully mating them with similar offspring. So he knew something like that was going on. There's a whole series of these things that seemed to came together, and he came up with a theory. We don't think he had a kind of moment of being struck by lightning where it all just came to him. It came to him gradually over time as he accumulated kind of more and more evidence in his own mind, I think. I did a lot of research. First of all, there's so much written about Darwin, so many biographies. You know, they would take up an entire room. My book, I hesitate for people to read it unless they realize that it's a novel. So that means parts of it are made up, and made up to make a point or for dramatic purposes. So I very deliberately set out and injected a few lies into it. And the biggest lie is I include as a major character one of his daughters, Lizzie, about whom not much is known. She's been lost to history, kind of, but I give her a whole background which she did not have. And that's all just for creative purposes. I wanted to make a story out of it. So I don't hew to the historical record in a part of the book. All the science in it, I wouldn't change. And I thought it would be fun to switch things. I mentioned before that Darwin was a kind of a thought of himself, as would anyone from his class at that time, as sort of the top of the heap. On the Beagle, there was this man from Tierra del Fuego who had been kidnapped as a young boy years before by the captain of the Beagle and was being returned to his native land. His name was Jimmy Buttons. That was his nickname. And I thought it would be fun, since Darwin was, and everyone else on the ship thought they were so superior, if it could turn out that Darwin actually got the theory from visiting Jimmy Buttons's tribe way up in the mountains and talking to a shaman who basically laid it all out at a point where, you know, they present the Western idea, including the Christian idea, and this shaman says, well, we have a different notion. We think life came from very simple forms, and describes the whole theory. It did not happen like that, but that was the point of the book, to just turn that part upside down for the fun of it. And then Darwin is there with a competing scientist who was on the Beagle, but not in Tierra del Fuego. And they realize in my book, in the novel, that whoever gets back home first with his great idea will become famous forever and ever. And there's a kind of race to get back to London to publish it. That's all fiction. I hope nobody ever believes it. But it did come out at a time when Darwin was a little bit under attack And so I think that to some degree might have sharpened the book more than I meant for it to be, because I think Darwin was a great, great person. You know, he's as a scientist, he's somebody who seems accessible in a way. His book, all of his books, are written simply. You can understand them to this day, and they're very persuasive. He's not like, to my mind, Isaac Newton or Einstein, these people who are just geniuses of a different order. You can't imagine being in Einstein's shoes. I can't. I can't really even understand a lot of it. But you can imagine somehow being Darwin if you're dogged enough and relentless and smart enough and just kind of keep at it. So he's like an everyman in that sense. And there's so much to admire in him and so much to empathize with at the same time.